It's an honor to have the first panel on HR management or management of human talent in the age of AI. Two important foci for this panel is one is a little bit more focused on artificial intelligence, in particular as a technology. We are talking about digital transformation in other panels, but this is a little bit more focused on artificial intelligence, but also specifically function of managing humans. We will talk about HR, but it's not only about HR. And I want to thank Arvind Malhotra and Chelsea Donhue for helping us to put together this brilliant panel of people, quite diverse, quite interesting set of backgrounds. And I want to introduce our panelists today, Kenya Odure. She holds a doctorate in human factors experimental psychology from North Carolina State University. Sorry, you are in the wrong place. Kenya is acceptable. It's not true. We'll try to be nice to you. Kenya is a human-centered researcher, strategist, and solution designer, leading business strategy and organizational change in human-centered solution definitions and design thinking. That's the strength of Kenya. After nearly 20 years in enterprise software development organizations, she formed Dean Geeks, which is a business consulting and staffing firm. She's also an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Computer Science at NC State University. The next panel is Phaedra Poinjoris, is IBM's global consulting leader for responsible AI. She's on the IBM Academy of Technology Leadership Council and serves on the advisory board of several academic institutions. She won the United Nations Moment of Influence in STEM and Inclusivity Award in 2019, received the Social Innovator Award, Fellow of the American Democracy Institute in 2011, and in 2007 was recognized by the Women Engaged International as being one of the top 100 women in the game industry. She is currently pursuing a PhD in AI and ethics. Ron Williams is currently professor of the practice at the Keenan Flagler Business School, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill here, where he has taught the MBA courses and executive MBA programs with a focus on value generation, strategic innovation, and most recently now AI's business value. He joined the university in 2002 after retiring from, there are a lot of IBM folks here, I gather from IBM, where he held various management positions in sales, marketing, and consulting. Ron obtained his MBA from Indiana University and is also the co-author of The Value Path, Embedding Innovation in Everyday Business when the customer make the rules. And John Lemon is solution specialist at SAS. Upon joining SAS in August of 2007, John's primary focus has been working with federal, state, and local government and commercial customers to implement industry leading performance management, workforce analytics, costing, and fraud prevention solutions through this integration of technology, processes, people, and methodologies. Prior to joining SAS, John was a budget director at the Department of Homeland Security, where he managed over $5 billion appreciated funds annually. John also worked with Booz Allen Hamilton, where he honed his skills in performance management, fraud detection, and prevention, while supporting various chief financial and program management offices through multiple federal, civilian, and defense agencies. He earned his MBA degree from the Florida Institute of Technology. Thank you, everyone. John is coming from Virginia, but we appreciate all of you locals. So let's get started. And we've got a bunch of questions, not a bunch, but a few questions. These are guiding questions, so feel free to improvise, talk about anecdotes, experience, and things of that nature that can be helpful. So let's start, because again, this is about a little bit more about AI. What are the potential impacts of AI in transforming management function, management of human specifically? So AI has been around for 60 years. For students in the room, this is not a new concept. What is interesting this time around? You go ahead.
I think coming from human factor psychology, When we look at the application in human resource management, I think that there's a delicate balance between reliance on that technology. What decisions can you rely on that technology to make? And understanding the information that's presented in order to make the right decisions, because individuals are different. We're all different in terms of our performance, our approach, the way we think. So understanding how that technology can help you make decisions, but not be the sole source of decision making.
And understanding the pitfalls of it as well, I think.
Exactly.
I think also, like you're saying, just understanding how the technology is being applied and making sure that if there is some type of bias in there, or understanding how to detect that type of bias. It may be unconscious bias, but just understanding how to detect it. And then once you detect it, what do you do about it? Like, how do you make sure that you mitigate that as well? I know there was an example, and it may have even been Google a few years ago. They were running a lot of AI on recruiting, and it would go through and it would say, what are really good employees that we've had in the past, and what are their traits, and what, of our employee pool now, our recruiting pool now, how many of those traits can we apply to the new folks? And the algorithms come out, and it was always saying men were always better than women in this. And that was because it was based off of prior data where men were dominant in the technology space. And therefore it would say a man is going to be better than a woman. That's not necessarily true, but it's understanding why it's telling you that, and going back and then kind of uncovering where that bias may be, and then how to mitigate it as you're coming up with new ways of doing things.
To tack on to what he just said, so it was Amazon.
That's what it was.
Yeah,
it was one of them.
It was Amazon. And what was,
can't blame Google.
So just to tack on a little bit more detail about that story, they actually had the best of intentions. Like they actually rolled it out as part of their diversity, equity, and inclusivity effort. And the way that they promoted that, or underscored it, was they said that the algorithm was blind to gender and race, right? But what was interesting, as John was saying, is that they trained the algorithm with star performer traits of historic Amazon leaders. And those star performers happen to be white men, but also of high socioeconomic means. So they would graduate from Ivy League schools. So even though
10 years worth of data.
Oh yeah,
this is not simple stuff.
Yeah. And what was interesting, again, even though the algorithm was blind to gender and race, if you happen to have in your resume, in your application, that you were a Girl Scout troop leader, because the algorithm had never seen that as a high performing pattern, your resume got a low score. So to that end, of course they recognized that and then yanked it. They're no longer using it. But it's an important lesson about the idea of bias being baked into the rest of the data. And just by making an algorithm blind is not gonna help you.
But I go back a long ways, folks. And when I was with IBM, even in IBM, many of the managers did not really need to understand technology. Okay. They had to understand what we had to offer, but okay, that's an impossible case today. And the managers everyone is going to have to understand what this stuff is capable of doing and what it isn't capable of doing. And I am amazed at everything I read, how often it comes up, and what they're saying about AI is not what's really going on with AI. So I'm going to say that the first step of this one is there's going to have to be a new level of understanding of technology, not just what it can do, but is also what it can't do.
To tack on, so I would also add, it's really important to think about the intent of the AI model. Is the intent of the AI model really to augment a human? Is it really meant to make their world better, or their environment better in some way? So for example, there's a lot of interest in using AI models to predict attrition. you know, when someone is likely to leave an organization or leave a company. I think there's an opportunity to actually flip that narrative and instead use AI to look and see like, what's working? Why do people stay? What are the data sets that need to be in place in an environment to get people to love their job and want to stay and are happy and productive there?
I think the key to what was stated was the trust factor. So building or developing trust in that data set and what's coming out of it in terms of the AI recommendations or what decisions are being made from it. In a lot of cases require you to understand what it's not capable of. And where we're not there yet is surfacing of that information in an articulate way where people can see this data is limited in these ways or flawed in these ways so that you can understand what it's not going to do.
I think also putting it in context is important too. You may have an employee that is hitting all of their key performance measures. They're producing what they're supposed to produce. They're on time. It's on budget. It's on schedule. But they may not be happy for some reason. And you're going to need things like maybe unstructured data that are in employee exit surveys or employee satisfaction surveys to pull out and say, yeah, I'm meeting all my measures, but I hate my job. And I'm going to leave in probably 6 months because it's bad work-life balance or whatever the thing is. On paper, with the numbers, it may look like that person is very, very happy because they're a very good performer, when in reality, you can use data to kind of support that. Maybe they're not. I mean, usually before there was AI, you would have managers that would come up and go, you know, how are things going at home? You know, tell me about little Johnny's soccer game or whatever. The computer's not necessarily, artificial intelligence isn't necessarily going to do that, but there are ways that we can go after data to put some context around what's happening with that person's well-being.
It can help to drive those starting points.
Correct.
But shouldn't be the end point.
Absolutely. It should give an indicator of, hey, this person may need a little more attention, a little more help. You may want to look at them from a different angle, and then that can start the conversation. So it's a tool. It's not a substitution for actual human intervention.
So Rob has a question back there.
This is a great discussion. So as an educator, as a faculty member at SILS, you know, we think a lot about how to educate our students on the issues that you guys are talking about. And it struck me as you guys are talking, you guys are in an interesting position because you've got some more of these experiences from your direct experiences. So what are some things that maybe you could talk through with us that can help us to help our students understand the nuances of this new AI in work situation?
Thank you for the question.
Roll up our sleeves now.
No. So firstly, I mean, what I'd want to relay is earning trust in AI is not a technological challenge. It's a socio-technological challenge, which means it has to be approached holistically. It can't just be solved by technology alone. And it's a team sport in every sense of the word. So when we talk about the importance, for example, diversity, equity, inclusivity, and I know there's a panel after lunch on that subject, it's not just about looking at your team of data scientists and asking yourself, how many women are on this team? How many minorities are on that team? But also difference, not just in gender, race, ethnicity, but also worldview, skill set, role. I mean, I'm working on client engagements now where some of our most valuable teammates have backgrounds in anthropology, sociology, psychology, and yet, including in higher ed institutions, we've been promoting this space like it's just for those who self-categorize as coders or machine learning scientists or data scientists or computer scientists. Why are we doing that? We desperately need people who can think about positive intent. What's the intent of an AI model? What's responsible use look like? What is the experience of a human after they've been augmented by artificial intelligence? To incorporate ethics, not just at the end, like it's part of quality assurance, but something that as soon as an idea comes about for using an AI, that it's considered like, who is this going to impact and in what way? So that you can make the right safeguard rails. And I'm convinced that there's some exercises we're doing with clients right now to use design thinking to help them through this process. these design thinking exercises could absolutely be introduced to students earlier and earlier on in their educational career. There's no reason we can't bring this to high schools and middle schools, even the elementary schools. We desperately need to open up the aperture and make this a much more inclusive and accessible conversation to more different kinds of people.
And I think it's not something that you do and you sit it down and it's done. You've got to revisit it because things are going to change. There was a comment earlier that in this microsecond, this is the way we thought. And it was good thinking, but things have changed. Now that we've gotten used to this way, there's new ways of doing things. So going back and revisiting, I think is also extremely.
Let me take the classroom for a minute. Okay, we send a student in to learn finance, and they come over here and they learn accounting. And by the way, if we're lucky, they go over and learn some English in the process, right? Okay. Now, how do you take diverse people, just like we try to do in the business world, and put them together so that they teach each other what's going on? I'm going to put Daniel on the spot for a minute back here. Yeah. Okay. You're trying to do a course with a computer science group and business students combined, right? How much are they really able to learn from one another when you put them in that context and put them on teams?
Well, when they sit next to each other, which they don't, they learn nothing from each other. Then you force them into teams, 50% of each. And then the first team assignment is a complete fail. And then they learn from that. Because I always tell the business school students, say, all right, let's get together. We're going to have a plan. Here's our idea. Y'all see us folks go figure it out through the algorithm. We'll need time to do. We're going to wrap it all up, have a nice story, put some nice graphs in there, good pictures and messages, and then we're going to present the next morning. We'll tell you what to say. Well, that goes completely off the charts.
Right.
Because the CS folks come back with all these food analysis, which have nothing to do with the actual problem. And the business school folks don't understand what the heck that means. So in assignment 2, this changes dramatically. Then they learn to speak the same language, we saw a nice picture in the presentation earlier, virtually, or in a small team at Google, they sit at the same desk, they say, what are you doing, what am I doing, what does this mean? So there is a huge learning there.
So we've got to find a way to change the whole education process such that we actually are teaching the whole problem, the whole set of issues at one time. And it's got to be a diverse group of people. And I don't mean diversity necessarily in terms of women and men, but I mean diversity in terms of what people know and what they bring to the table. I was saying to Chris at break time, because I've just discovered Chris and someone who can help me from a technological standpoint. I had an architect, and wherever I went in the business, wherever I moved, he went with me. Because he knew stuff technically I could not possibly know. And he could talk to me in a way that I could understand it. To me, we've got to put these diverse teams together where we really are integrating the technology folks and the business folks. It have to do that.
So if I can speak to my experiences coming from the corporate software development world and being on UX teams or leading UX teams, we've always been the glue. So business and technology need someone to translate. So the roles I've always served in are in that capacity. And so I take that into the classroom. So in the HCI class that I teach at State, the software engineering students are obviously focused on driving to solutions. And I'm working on getting the department to see the opportunity to bring in other disciplines. But until they're on board with that, what I do is I let students that reach out to me from the School of Design, Psychology, I let them audit the class. And I force a project from the beginning of the semester to the end, and we follow a design thinking, human-centered design approach. So that churn that we just heard about in terms of not getting it right at first and then second time around they do, they have to start the process of working collaboratively. And what I've seen, and I'm trying to sell to the department, is the projects that have had the best outcomes are the ones where the team has been cross-functional, coming from different disciplines. And so there is a way for us to do this, to package it up and replicate it across the university space. It's just the silos of academia, which, you know, coming from industry, it's challenging. So
I'll have to come talk to you about the
Absolutely.
test when I teach at UNC.
absolutely.
So what I hear underlying a lot of these things, because Rob's question was about educating the next generation of students when it comes to these big socio-technical challenges, is understanding translational skills, being able to speak different languages. That is missing in your class in the business school. People who can act as boundary spanners between different communities, between different teams with different backgrounds. So let's move forward with the next question. If there is any question from the audience, if not, how can we empower our human talent when these smart technologies are put into use?
I'll go ahead and take the first swipe at that. I think a lot of it is just educating people on what the technology can do. I think there's a lot of people that maybe sit around and they look at a filing cabinet full of papers that have a lot of knowledge in it. And, man, I wish I could sit there and read all those papers, but it's going to take me 6 months, and who has the time to do that? Well, guess what? There's technology out there that can go through all of that stuff, tell you what the content is, what the subject is, what the sentiment is, and give that to you in a relatively short period of time. If you're not aware that there's tools out there to help you do those types of things, you're not going to start thinking in that way. You're only going to focus on that one filing cabinet and not think about all the other filing cabinets that are out there, or understand that there are analytics that can link different networks of people. You've seen the push pins and the strings that people do for investigations. There's software out there that can do that. If you're not aware of that type of technology or that type of technique, then you're not going to start thinking in that way. So I think it's important so people understand the types of tools that are at their disposal and how they can use those tools.
If I could say that differently, a lot of what I cover in my class is around allocation of function and looking at from the standpoint of what we as humans are capable of from a computational standpoint versus a system. But when you get to that AI, allowing you to have access to more robust, higher volumes of data, but you then are able to make better decisions because you have more insights than you would have if you had to go to that file cabinet and go through all of it yourself. Understanding that that is the benefit of AI, or where you should look for AI in your decision making, but that you ultimately can't just lean on what the system recommends or tells you. You've got to do something in terms of some sort of analysis or follow-up in terms of conversations like what John mentioned earlier.
And as soon as it used to be where you would ask a question, and then after you've done all the manual labor, you would get the answer in 6 weeks. Well, now we can ask a question and you'll get that answer in 6 minutes, which is going to cause you to ask another question, and then another question, and then another question. You would have to wait 6 weeks until you saw the results of that first question to ask the second question. Now we can ask the second, third, and fourth question all in a day. So it's coming at you faster, but it's also allowing you to ask deeper, more insightful questions, and allowing you to get farther down that knowledge road.
We've seen some reports that about 80% of AI efforts get stalled in proof of concept. And it's for a wide variety of different reasons, mainly because the investment in the AI wasn't directly tied to business strategy, is one. Another is that, and even more prolific, people just don't trust the results of the AI model. So when thinking about like, what does it take to trust an AI? Again, it's a, as I mentioned, socio-technological challenge, and there's all kinds of things to consider. Like, is it fair? Is it explainable? If it makes a decision that could directly affect me, can I ask it a simple question like, what data did you use to make this decision about me? Is it transparent? Am I even being told that an AI model is about to make a decision to infer my skills or tell me if I'm going to get this job or not, or if I'm going to apply to a business school and get in or not, right? Another one is it robust? Like, is it set up in such a way where a hacker wouldn't be able to disadvantage me and advantage another group of people? So does it maintain data privacy? I mean, there are all kinds of things to consider when you're thinking about, like, am I making a model that people in HR or wherever would actually trust it? Then you need to think about like what principles are you going to establish as your foundation for the use of artificial intelligence? What values are you going to stand by? So where I work at IBM, there's three major principles. One is that AI is meant to augment human intelligence and not replace it. The second is that data and insights from those data belong to the creator alone. Right? You have to ask for consent before you're using someone's data to train an AI model. And the third is that AI models should be transparent and explainable, right? Meaning you can't just run an AI model that's gathering input or making decisions about a person without telling them so, right? And offering explainability, no more black box models. So again, these kinds of things are really important to consider if you're going to start investing in the use of AI in any field. If you want people to trust those models, these are things you have to consider.
I go with what they got.
Sure,
They've covered it well.
I think when we go back to the point around the data coming back so much more quickly than if we had to go through things manually, a lot of the challenge that that poses is now you have to retrain your workforce to understand that their role changes. The way in which they look at how they used to spend months trying to infer something from data, they're now having to do that in weeks. But that means that they have to have a different level of inquiry. They have to look at their role changing in terms of you're not so much doing that manual labor of crawling through data, you're having to now make decisions that are based on you asking the why, the 5 whys instead. So I think a lot of organizations, what I've seen, at least in the consulting world, is where we've gone in and proposed to a client, here's an opportunity for you to replace some of what you're doing manually today with AI, and this is how the roles in your organization would change. When you present that to a team, some of the folks in the room are impacted by that AI. They're not excited to hear that because the thought process that my job is going to change, not go away, that conversation is a secondary conversation that wasn't had at that point. So that's the first thing we've got to think about. And then secondly, I come from the human factors world. So we think about things from an industrial engineering standpoint. When you think about machines like elevators or black box systems, there's a lot that goes into testing. Fault testing, especially if they're mission critical systems. So that level of testing that's done with those types of systems have to also be done with AI systems. And today, I don't think we see that apples to apples relationship because it's a different type of technology.
And because it's amorphous, it's not like you don't see the harm the same way that you see the tangible products like elevator. The harm can be quite massive, but you don't see the same. It's the intangible nature of the technology. Any questions from, yes, Gary?
This point that was just made about sort of testing. I mean, is anyone familiar with sort of Six Sigma type strategies for testing? I mean, even machine learning, let alone deep learning kinds of systems. I mean, I assume people are working on this, but if anyone's found things that work, please pass them along because I think a lot of us are be very interested in hearing that.
So the one thing that came in the conversation was this very big urge that people may not say it, but it's actually underlying a lot of AI-centered initiative is automating people away, replacing them. How can we move beyond it and forge a better partnership between AI and humans?
I want to start. I'm going to back up on this one a little bit. To start with, does your organization know where it's going with technology? Is it basically going to, are you planning on being a different organization, a different business model? Are you planning on just automating what you got? All right. We got fascinated by this when we started looking at the surveys over the last 5 years. Okay, and this was, we watched them roll out as we were interested. there was a consistent picture that started at about 64% of executives believe it was going to transform their company in 3 to 5 years. And I think it's up now somewhere around 87%. At the same time, something never more than 25% thought they were actually leading in what was going on. All right. So there was a major dichotomy, a major disconnect between what they think technology will do and what they're actually doing about the technology. So the first thing to me that goes on with this, and by the way, you can't take AI and separate it completely from the cloud, and you can't, and Internet of Things and analytics. These things are all playing together. It's a conjunction that's coming together. All right. And the point involved is executives have got to decide where we're going. Are we going to be different, or are we going to be the same, just better, just more efficient, more relevant, right? And then it's got to get communicated. And if it isn't communicated, we're going to automate everything that we got going on because it's the low-hanging fruit. By the way, can you make some money doing that? Absolutely. But what you're going to end up with at the end of the time is you're going to probably end up with a bunch of things automated. And by the way, you look around, you say, you know what? We're obsolete. We're gone. We just got moved out of the space, right? And so I think it starts, number one, with executive deciding what they're going to do with this stuff. How is it going to change their business world? And if it's not, fine, but know what you're doing with it. And if you know it's going to change, then figure out how it's going to change and communicate it. Because if you don't communicate that, it's going to go into the automation space. I swear it will, okay? Because the people can't get empowered unless they know where they're going and what they're supposed to be doing with this stuff. Now, the fact is, it's also going to take a long time. This 3 to 5 year business is absolutely ludicrous. May I ask if anybody in the room has heard of Fernand Braudel? It's exactly what I would have expected. Because I had, okay, until a colleague introduced me to it. He is probably the most influential historian of the 20th century, okay? And what he did was he basically, by the way, he wrote 3 books, total of 1,800 pages. I'm not advising you to go read. It's called Capitalism and Civilization and Capitalism. All right? But several of the things he pointed out was, number one, if you're really going to get change, real progress, it comes when you change the limits of the possible in the structures of everyday life. So all of the stuff that Daniel was going through this morning is exactly what happens. People think the technology is going to change. We are human animals. We love to hang on to things. And where therefore change comes slowly. So I can get a technology rolling down the path, right? It still may take 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years for it to really have its impact, okay? Now, the reason that's important is you have to, if you're going to say we're changing, you also have to be realistic about how it's going to change. And you've got to communicate that with the people so they know where to put their energy. But otherwise, it's going to go to automate. I swear it will. And it's not the way that's not the way it should go.
Other thoughts on that questions?
I think it's not just AI, robotics, automation. We're on the cusp of a technology tsunami. And there is concern with respect to the displacement of workers and rethinking our education systems and just preparing the next generation for what is to come. I think we all need to double down on education, K through 12 in particular, and not just wait until higher ed to introduce, as I said, these thoughts to to students. I wanted to quickly answer your question that you had. Yes, there are companies that audit AI and ML models, IBM, Microsoft, there are others. But I would also say that we can't just assume because an AI model passes an audit, oh, I'm good and squeaky clean and ready to go. You know what I mean? Because how often does that model get audited? What scores did it, what is being told to the end user, to subjects with respect to that model? What is the experience for an end user? What's the intent of that AI model? Just a quick story about intent. The country of Spain had procured an AI model for their police department to predict the level of recidivism of domestic abusers. Okay. And a couple months ago, a psychologist went to the police force and said, I'm really worried about my ex-husband becoming violent to me and my 2 daughters. And the police put his information, ex-husband's information, into the system. The AI model spit out a low score and they didn't put a protective order in place. And 2 weeks later, the woman and the 2 children were dead. And you have to ask the question, like, who was in the room when the decision was made to make an AI model that did that? What safeguards were in place? What conversations were had? Who knows whether it passed an audit or not with respect to fairness? You see what I'm saying? Like, there's so much more to this challenge than what you might immediately sense in the market. It's not a technological challenge. It's much, much, much bigger.
That's a great example. In the early days of sort of search, we used to actually show not just the search engine, the SERPs, the results, but you would maybe see the page rank score, or in earlier days than that, whatever the algorithm was. And it didn't need much, but at least there was some number there. And for some people, that gave a sense of, oh, this isn't an answer, it's a probability, or it's an estimation. I mean, is that sort of enough to kind of push us toward perhaps more trustable systems?
I honestly think we need to go further, and it starts again with education and just explaining what this space is to more and more different kinds of people, so they know what to look for, so that they can even know whether something is trustworthy or not. You see what I'm saying? Maybe it's like, if I'm going to a bank and I heard a rumor that maybe they're using an AI model, am I being informed that it's determining the percentage interest rate on my loan? Am I being informed? Can I find out, like, once it makes that decision, like, was I asked for consent for it to use my data? Was I told what data was being used to make this decision about me? Am I being told how often that is being audited? In the audit, are there accuracy scores? There's a story from Michigan. The state of Michigan had procured an AI model to predict welfare fraud. It ran for 3 years with an accuracy score of less than 10%, economically destroying thousands of families. And now the question is, like, who's accountable? And that's another thing to consider. Like, when you're looking at an AI model or scrutinizing one, is there something about who's accountable if it's wrong? Yeah, because it's only probably, right? Yeah.
That goes back to legislation and mandates, and that there's got to be some. I came in halfway in the previous talk with guardrails. What are the guardrails around what you surface up and what people can do, and the implications of making bad decisions based on that information?
And are you surfacing it in such a way that the lay person understands? Not reason code 82137. You know what it is?
Well, sometimes those are embedded in the system to retain the current structure of pattern organizations. Those lack of transparency are done intentionally, or being used intentionally, not necessarily designed that way.
There's a reason, one quick one, there's a reason the DoD, Department of Defense, that an AI cannot pull the trigger. Okay. It may have all the understanding that they believe it does, but the fact is, it's still, if there's going to be a trigger pull, it's still going to be done by a human.
So far.
Well, I mean, this is part of,
legislation says.
we're into ethics on this one, and I hope that doesn't change.
But it's also the definition of mission critical. We've got to kind of shift that definition to apply to decisions around people's life.
Yeah.
In terms of their resources they're disseminated. It's defining mission critical to be more than
Killing people.
just.
I like that example of as horrible as it is, what happened in Spain, police. Unfortunately, this happens every day also without AI. But it raises a more interesting question, and that is, what is the human AI interaction? How does that lead to different decisions when you think of confirmation bias, automation bias? So how do outcomes change if human and AI work together? Because that might sometimes make things worse or better, and it's very unclear to me.
Do you know the ProPublica story from the judicial system? So for those who don't know, there was an AI that was being used by judges in the judicial system to predict the recidivism of prisoners in the courtroom. And ProPublica did a big expose. This was a couple of years ago, and said, "Hey, this is actually trained on really historically racist data. You cannot use this because that bias gets systemically calcified." So they pulled it. One could imagine, though, an AI being used in collaboration with judges to inform a judge, you know, judge, when you skip lunch, you actually have a differing pattern in terms of how you dole out. Yeah, exactly. Like, how can AI find insights to make that judge be better?
So angry judges are bad.
You want your judge to eat a lot of pasta, have a lunch hangover, and then he's more lazy.
No, but that's important, right? Because if you look at this example, what if the AI was trained on the same people's decisions that now use it, then you have a confirmation bias. So you're making things worse on top of worse. And that's where I find this is an interesting question that, yeah, you can audit an AI system, but you need to audit the pairing, the person and the AI jointly, because two people can arrive at a different conclusion from the same output, the same as people have different levels of risk aversion. I mean, what's a 60% chance or a 40% chance? I always tell my students I should have become a meteorologist. You can say there's 50% chance of rain, you still get paid.
The work never ends, which is why behavioral science, you know, with Dr. Ogbor is representing, you know, behavioral science is so important in this consideration, which is why we need more than coders thinking about this space. What is the experience for humans, and constantly testing that and forcing it to be better.
Well, humans have bias as well. So recognizing the bias that's inherent in a human that is then coding their same bias into the AI is something that we also have to be aware of. So,
Rob.
All right, can I have two questions? One, I'd like to come back and follow up on this idea of quality assurance, because I think that's an interesting one. The elevator example, right? Don't assume that the elevator should not crash, right? That can be a quality assurance kind of criteria. How do we set those quality assurance criteria for the enormous diversity of systems that we're incorporating AI into, right? So what are those criteria? You know, I guess the second part of this question is a little bit of a different direction. We have people making these decisions now. We're replacing or supplementing those people with AI. There's biases in both. So what are we looking for from the AI system? What do we want the AI system to exhibit here? That we feel like a person is exhibiting, or maybe is not exhibiting, that we'd like to have the AI system reflect.
Connecting them to more information, more insights, more ideas, so that they can be better. Ultimately, is what I would say.
Triangulate the problem, come at it from a bunch of different ways, and make sure that if we are coming at it from the right side of the room versus the left side of the room, what we were saying earlier, that we understand that there is bias on one side, that we can recognize it from the other side.
So it seems to me a key word that is embedded in all this conversation is the establishment of context. And so one of the questions I have is, we were talking about one of the benefits of AI is to shorten the amount of time between asking a question and getting an answer. And that can be an efficiency benefit. But my question is, what is lost in achieving that efficiency, and what's the potential impact, negative impact on context and establishment of context? As I spend time reading one article and then the next article, my context and understanding shifts as a result of the process of getting to that answer. But when the machine gives me the answer, what's lost?
You can do things quicker, but you can also make the wrong decision quicker. You can make a mistake faster. So I think having that additional context that you're talking about, it allows you to also gain that additional context.
Agility.
Yeah.
And getting to the right answer. And to your point, context matters. I say that probably every class with my students is context is always the factor that is going to impact your decisions more than anything. And the challenge is today, AI is created in a way to have a specific context and doesn't necessarily have the flexibility to consider others.
So what is how all of this still comes back to, what do I really understand about AI?
That's right.
Okay. Because if I think it's a magic button and it's got the answer, watch out. Okay. I mean, I've got to have enough knowledge of what this stuff can do and can't do for me to be able to step back and say, all right, there's still human judgment involved in everything I'm doing. And I don't think, if we went around the room and asked, what is AI? We would get as many different answers as we have people sitting in the room. And some, there may be, many of them may be right, but do they get to the core of what it can and can't do?
Well, and then also as you said earlier, what's the fundamental questions that we're asking it to solve?
Yeah.
So
we're back to its capability.
So as a librarian, a profession that spends a lot of time focused on the answer, we need to sort of broaden and spend some time loving the question as well.
And to your point, being a librarian, one or other thing to consider is, how is the algorithm being optimized and to do what? So for example, social media, YouTube, right? These filtered bubbles that are promoting more and more extremist views, delivering answers for us, but optimized for something that you may not exactly.
Optimized to get hits, not to actually.
There's a question.
A good word.
Back
Yeah,
here.
that actually gets at what I was going to ask about. So right now we have a lot of deep fake videos and audio and all kinds of things. What do you think are the risks of having legitimate looking deep fake AI, whether by bad actors, whether government bad actors or individual bad actors?
I think it's back to that ethics question. I mean, it's a tool. It can be used for good or bad. And I guess it depends on what side of the equation you are, what's determined as good or bad. So I think you have to have some ethics built into the process of artificial intelligence to make sure that people aren't using it for bad purposes.
Goes back to legislation.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, it goes back to legislation. We have to have some guardrails or some rules around application and that sort of thing.
And it's also, it's because this stuff is now so global, there's different ways of looking at privacy type issues. Maybe the US is a lot more private than, or a lot more private than China or the Soviet or the Russia or whatever. Just because we think it should be one way doesn't mean that they're going to think it's going to be the same way either. So.
Can I say one thing that we have to look at our relationship with technology in general, AI specifically, we have to look at that relationship as an interpersonal relationship with another human. And when we get to know someone, there's an exchange, there's a back and forth. I say something, you say something back, we get some sort of common ground in terms of where we stand on an issue or what we understand. We have to look at AI the same way, and if it's black box, you don't ever get that opportunity to develop any sort of relationship to understand what it's gonna, what it's giving you is actually, valid and reliable and that sort of thing.
But then we really need to start at the elementary school level,
We
educating
absolutely
kids
do.
about how these things
We
work.
absolutely do.
Preach it, preach it.
So Chelsea here, got a question.
Yeah, I from your experience, I guess, do you feel like senior leaders are really bought into, I guess, this importance of the relationship? Because I think it's kind of that idea of, are companies responsible to just their shareholders and profit maximization, or do they actually care about their employee experience? I mean, I think we know Amazon has done the most with AI, and we can talk. But Amazon has done well with AI, and so they're the example that we love to talk about. But we also don't hear a lot about how Amazon employees are loving their job and have a great experience with the technology, and how your Amazon drivers love how it allows them to be more efficient. They're missing on that side of things. So I guess and I think it is a shift from, are companies responsible to their shareholders, or are they responsible to their employees? Like, what is at the end of the day? So I guess, is there buy-in from, our senior leaders?
It's coming. It's coming. I mean, the more and more regulation we're seeing rolled out, which of course is the stick, right? That's the stick. But then with respect to employee engagement, like, corporations are their people, made up of their people. If you don't have good people, productive, happy people, what have you got?
When the Amazon guy comes to your house and hands you a box, you ever try to have a conversation with them? Ask how long it's gonna, how their day is going. They don't want to talk to you. They are on a schedule, and it's being clocked on how fast that truck moves, how many passes. So you want kind of that, typically you would want the interaction with a customer and really to get to know them. But in the business model that they don't have time for that. It's more about just getting people boxes. So
They would have time for that conversation.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep.
But that hasn't changed. FedEx, long before AI, operated in exactly the same way. If you ask, I'd like you to explain to me whether, I'm sorry, this is the job.
Call that number.
Right? Okay. So, I mean, let's not blame the stuff necessarily on AI for what's going on. It has always been an issue of, are we focused on stakeholders or are we focused on shareholders? And there was a swing back in the 70s that basically moved it from stakeholders to shareholders. And the pendulum, I think, is coming back. Okay. And because you need happy customers, you need happy employees. I mean, this is just, and of course, the sustainability piece is coming in very big into the picture. So are we moving? I think we're moving back more to that. And we've always got to ask the question, what are we doing with this stuff? Right?
It's a balancing act, and it changes. And it changes the more we learn about this stuff, and the more information and the faster we get it, it's going to change things even more rapidly.
There are things, let's take Amazon. Let's go stay there. Okay. Okay. Before they put robots in the warehouses, they were pushing carts down an aisle, and they had a list of what things they had to pick, right? What the robots did was they changed to the point where the rack now comes to the picker rather than the picker going to the rack, right? Now, is he happier? I don't know. That's a good question. But running down the aisle and picking things from an aisle isn't particularly fun. Not only that, but I'm going to get a lot of accuracy out of this, and I'm going to get a lot of speed out of this. And these are all trade-offs. You know, from the time an order hits, you push the button for an order with one of the robotic main warehouses or fulfillment centers, that order can literally be out the door in 15 minutes, okay? I doubt that the picker is any less happy than they were when they were being pushed to move down the aisle. But I'm trading off now, can I get that speed for the satisfaction of the customer? It is always a contentious system, and I don't have a simple answer on this one. I really don't.
So one benefit I can see from a human factors perspective, you have fewer repetitive stress injuries and musculoskeletal injuries. So there is that benefit that now I'm not pushing, I'm not lifting, that sort of thing. So you have to weigh those trade-offs and understand the current state. Kind of what is AI going to benefit? Some of those benefits might help the individual, some of the business, but there might be some things that also hurt the individual. Unintended. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Chris.
Yeah, I was gonna, multiple of the topics you talked about, I in a simple way separate the world into two things. One, every company, say, right, can use AI tactically in some instance for some near-term tactical immediate benefit. But in general, a lot of the things you talked about, what's your reaction to a company, if it's really going to be effective, has to start with a culture. And I'm seeing already from my IBM print, a culture from the top down, because it pervades every aspect you talked about, whether it's HR or it's all kinds of other facets here. How do you set the culture from the top down to enable the workforce to effectively leverage and even think about how it could be leveraged, empowering employees? That starts with the culture. What are your thoughts about that?
I love this question. Thank you. I feel like I've planted these questions in the audience. Awesome. Thank you. So we think a lot about that, about culture, what culture is required in order to responsibly curate AI. And what is happening right now within organizations to establish organizational AI governance is setting up ethics boards, AI ethics boards, right? But when you set up an AI ethics board, there's all kinds of questions to be asked. Like, are there disincentives for people to go to an ethics board? Or are people actually incentivized to go to an ethics board? Who's on that ethics board? Are there protections against conflicts of interest? Is there diversity on the ethics board? Is there a culture beyond the ethics board that is open enough to have discussions about the relationships between AI and people, and also an open enough culture to recognize the value that different skill sets bring in order to responsibly curate AI? Remember that the earlier conversation we were having about like getting different people on a team to work well together, getting those data scientists to work well with the sociologists, to recognize the value of industrial organizational psychologists. Like, that's the hard part. It's not the tech. It's not the tech. It's getting people to recognize the value of people very, very differently from them in terms of their worldview, their experience, their background. And so one of the things that we've done at IBM, and it's about 2 years running now, is we made something called a Center of Excellence, where anybody is invited. We don't care who you are, where you came from, or what your background is. We've got folks from research, we've got folks from design, we've got folks from consulting and product and tooling. And we host these regular calls about like what's happening. But also we've made this special liaison between the Center of Excellence and something called IBM's Academy of Technology. And the Academy of Technology is interesting in that they incubate these cool projects or initiatives that steer the company in new directions, right? So there's a category of initiatives around trusted systems. And we use the Center of Excellence as a volunteer army. Again, wide roles, wide skill sets to work on these initiatives so that collectively we're sharing what we're learning as a group. And we share it back. And in fact, we donate our findings to the open source community via the Linux Foundation. One example of a project we're working right now is on systemic equity. Typically, as we're talking about AI and fairness, people think equality, not equity. So what does it mean to optimize an AI model or someone's experience with respect to equity? That's one initiative, totally brand spanking new. There's another one we did around the Titanic data set. Imagining if there was an AI model to inform passengers or do a prediction on whether that passenger was the likelihood of them getting a life raft. And we picked an overtly biased data set, again, to imagine how would you design such an AI model, not just in terms of the tech and the explainers, but what does the user experience need to be to ultimately empower someone? And that's when we brought in the anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, designers. And it was through that kind of a project where a lot of people had epiphanies. The data scientists were like, wow, we hadn't really thought about what the UI needs to be for a passenger such that they could challenge the data and say, I upgraded my ticket just yesterday from Class C to Class A. I should get a better score, get a better prediction. So
I'd say seems like there's a great opportunity for all of you who are shaping young minds in business to really think about the topic of how to be a leader in setting the culture to enable effective use of AI. Because from that then flows the tactical instantiations, but it pervades everything from HR to
so true.
It's about the culture.
Chris, one of the things that I keep coming back to, even though it's not the question that's being asked, okay, is am I going to be an entirely different company?
Right.
Okay. I mean, let me take John Deere for a second, because we think of John Deere as a company that basically makes big tractors, right? And their theme always was basically bigger, faster, well, they call it badder. Okay, I don't care. Right? Okay.
In a good way.
They have been transforming over the last 25 years based upon the fact that the world needs to move to precision farming. We can't afford to just go out and spray the field with Roundup because we have GMO, right? We want to be able to kill the individual weed. We want to be able to treat just that particular acre, which by the way is even different in the amount of rain it gets from the one next to it. I mean, this is a whole complex game, right? Well, I mean, I'm remaking the company in this process. Today, they have more software engineers than mechanical engineers. Kind of blows your mind, right? The same thing's happening at GM and over in Stuttgart. But I am building, I'm telling the culture, I'm telling the company to start with, we're going someplace different, okay? And we're all going to have to think different to do this. And it's been, like I say, it's a 25-year journey, and they aren't there, but they have made incredible progress in terms of how they're doing it. If I don't know where I'm going, okay, I can do all these individual little things, but I still have to need it in a broader context of how does this stuff change where we go, right? And so I keep coming back to something that I learned many, many years ago about strategy. I need to go where I'm going. I need to communicate it. Now we're going to deal with a bunch of these things that David just talked about. We're going to deal with these as we go, but I still need to know the context of what might change.
I guess my point was that I absolutely agree. Once the business strategy, what you want your business to be, I was just looking for the context of, okay, if AI could be an enabler to help road step to that ultimate goal, a culture that enables the leverage use of AI, I was just looking for.
Can I give an example?
Sure.
So I recently had a conversation with a prospective client, and the company is one that's in the refrigeration industry. So our HVAC systems, for example, in our homes, and also bigger refrigeration tooling. And the conversation started with the culture in the company is one of sustainability. So she was coming to me to say, we want to start with looking at sustainability from the standpoint of how do we help our consumers that use our technology make better decisions? So how do we, in the Internet of Things, find ways to suggest turn your thermostat down at this time because you're not home, for example? But also, how do we look at internally the assets that we use, like our server farms, like our code bases? How do we look at being more sustainable around the way in which we manage technology in our organization, which again would require AI for someone to figure out, hey, that server down in this location in the center of the US is not, is not performant and it's causing energy challenges. So all of that started from the top, and in that conversation, what kept coming up was, as a company, we are focused on sustainability inside and outside. So that's an example of where it starts from the top, the primary focus. And she's coming to me, not because the leadership said, go figure out from someone who can focus on that sort of thing, what to do. But she then related that to her specific role working on a hardware team to then say, let me go back to one of my folks in user experience / human factors and see if she can help us figure out how to solve that. So I think that kind of mandate around philosophically as a company, what are we going to focus on, was a good start from the top down.
Yeah, who are we?
Who are we?
Can I add a little something onto your?
Absolutely.
That's a great example. So as you know, Nest is a part of Google, and so we know a little bit about thermostats. To your point, this is a complex problem, and in particular, when you're thinking about Internet of Things, you also not only have to think about usability and human factors, but also the social fairness of these things in ways you might not have thought about. For instance, a problem that we've had to solve is who gets to run the Internet of Things system at home. The husband, the wife, the spouse, the kids, the dog, they all have a say. And this becomes a
question in my house.
A really interesting problem, and it's sort of a fairness issue, is what happens if the couple splits up? Who gets to, and this is a real problem because we've seen examples where evil spouse leaves the home and turns the thermostat to 99.
There should have been a threshold on that thermostat.
But you see my point, right? It's not just a technology thing, you also have to think about the social. Do you share your Netflix password?
All the time.
So Netflix is unhappy with you. But you see my issue.
At Google, you have microphones all over my house with my Nest, so you can pick up the fight. You put a natural limit onto the thermostat.
And Google tells you who won.
And then Google calls the lawyer.
So it's interesting where you draw those boundaries.
All right, we've got time for a final question. I'd rather that come from the students back of the room. Give them a voice. Or put them on the spot and see if they can address any. Any questions, any final thoughts that you want to share? Yes.
So I'm not a student, but what if we use an AI to look at context, to look at those biases, so systematic sources? Because if the data set also huge, it's difficult for human to look into that.
Agreed.
And it's not just one data set, it's multiple data sets being put into a much larger data set. So it could be 5 or 6 different sources of data, each with their own, each with their own nuances and biases and that kind of stuff.
I think it would be difficult from a cognitive perspective to have a system. Some of the biases that I might have are not something that may show themselves in that whole kind of training data set. It's not something that someone can bake in based on my individual kind of biases. I don't know how feasible that is because some of the nuances of who we are as individuals, that's what makes us human.
What might be something that you don't care about today, but you're going to care about a lot tomorrow. No one really cared about the environmental effects of people's decisions 50, 100, 200 years ago, but we're very focused on it right now. What are we going to be like in another 50, 200 years from now? What are we going to care about then?
I think also another question is, once someone is presented with their bias so nicely by an AI.
Yeah. You're biased. No, I'm not. I'm biased and I hate you.
Humans are hard.
Context matters.
To expand your minds, your thinking. Multinational corporations, you know, want all be leaders in companies, multinationals. What's biased and unethical in one country is not in another country. How would you do that?
I think that's a very interesting end to our conversation. Thank you so much. Round of applause.